The more things change, the more they stay the same. That could be Call of Duty's slogan. Thanks to the open beta over the weekend, we got a glimpse of what has changed, but that is certainly not a guarantee. Now, I managed to test 3 versions over the weekend, and with this being multiplayer only, the big visual and engine upgrades from Infinity Ward and their version 9 engine are saved predominantly for the campaign, which was teased earlier this year and will be dropping in October. But this Twitch-based gameplay of multiplayer lives and dies by its performance, response and feel. So we shall start just there with performance. Taking the PlayStation 5 first, in that locked 60 FPS mode, we have a locked 60 FPS. In fact, not a surprise here considering it's the same target as the last generation of consoles, meaning you get the same rapid response here, and that includes those input times with a median of 50 milliseconds give or take on the PlayStation 5, which carries over to the other version in the Series X as well, which we'll get to in a moment. So as mentioned, the PS5 is a locked 60, the Series X is exactly the same. It's not really a surprise, could not find any dips and issues. There might be some in menu sections or loading, but overall any issues are probably going to be related to the network connection more than the input. And that means you get exactly the same flat line on that 60 FPS and around 50 milliseconds of median input time. It is very responsive and delivers those sharp, crisp input times the title is well known for, although the gameplay hasn't really moved on in any meaningful way. Representing the last generation versions is the PlayStation 4, and this holds again a pretty locked solid 60 FPS give or take. There's a couple of single frame drops here and there, but you'd never pick that up without this kind of frame rate analysis, and therefore you're getting again a very consistent and responsive title. It's certainly ever so slightly slower on input times than the next generation versions, to a region of around 6 milliseconds on average, but that's well within margin of error, and therefore you're looking around 55 milliseconds of input time for a 60 FPS title, which is still exceptional to this day. But as per all the other versions, the gameplay, the maps, the layout, all of that feels very old school at this point, without any drastic changes on that score. Even if the rendering has seen significant improvements at certain points, most of those are reserved for the single player, but it's still a good looking title on the PlayStation 4. There are some other areas though that fall foul of nowhere near 60 FPS, and that is those large Conquest style levels. They do struggle. Seemingly memory and or CPU bound, even GPU at certain points I'm sure, it can constantly flick between 33 and 16 milliseconds, giving us an uneven presentation on that frame time graph, as you can see. And this means that in these sections you're often hovering somewhere between the mid-40s to the low 50s. It's still okay, but far from the other maps, and certainly nowhere near the level we're seeing on the 60 FPS and even 120 FPS modes on the Series X and PlayStation 5. At this point it's certainly starting to show its age, and there are other visual blemishes that crop up.
Reloading! Changing back! Switching back! Hostile
LOD on the PlayStation 4, in these maps at least, is specifically impacted. Not just related to memory issues, but also CPU and GPU areas, I'm sure, along with good old-fashioned bugs. You can see the significant cutbacks in the triangle count on models, looking more like PS1 than PS4 at times. Objects can pop in very close to view, and the gaps between this and the Series X and PlayStation 5 are a good example of a game being reduced to fit into the smaller footprint and power budget these nigh on 10-year-old consoles are delivering. The extra power and RAM in the current generation helps this a lot, as does the resolution increase. Areas such as the ambient occlusion or even the TAA pass can cause heavy ghosting and a very stippled effect on all consoles, but due to the lower resolution of the PlayStation 4, it stands out much more as characters move. As does the software VRS the engine deploys, which reduces the very expensive cost of GPU pixel shading. That variable rate shading can cause bigger, lower resolution, chunky shading issues in the current build on PS4 and even on PS5, which can be worse as that version also has screen space shadows and higher AO passes along with reflections, all causing these blocky, chunky pixels you can see. The Series X is not as affected by this and may be using that DX12 API hardware option to help the quality here and deliver the same GPU cost reduction. Like pretty much COD titles from the engine over the past few years, they all appear to be using a temporarily reconstructed output that renders the width at half resolution and the height at full, although this may also be a half height. The reason for this is the counts can show 960 by 1080 on PS4 at times and then 1920 by 1080. DRS is of course possible, but the disocclusion of geometry almost always shows this single level of lower width, simply a breakdown in that reconstruction when these occur. The PlayStation 5 and Series X both render to 3840 by 2160 in the 60 FPS mode at least, but both show reconstruction signs of again half width, 1920 by 2160. As with all of these reconstruction techniques though, they rely on the engine's motion vectors, pixel movement and disocclusion artifacts are therefore harder to hide, as no previous data may exist from the 6-ish frames it appears the engine seems to use within its temporal buffers. The results are a game that is not as sharp as a 4K image of other titles, but much of that is down to the heavy post-processing the engine uses, which can soften it greatly. Seen here with the PlayStation 5 and Series X side by side with the exact same 4K target, but the world motion blur is turned on for the Series X and turned off for the PS5, meaning all movement causes an even softer image. Most, like myself, will likely turn this off in the menu, which is vital for a competitive title like this, and single player is where it should reside. Finally, like last year's release, you can also go into the menu and turn on the FX CAS sharpening, which is a welcome touch. And this leaves us with a game that runs very well on the now generation consoles, but the biggest boost is probably that 120 FPS mode. Once you turn this on, you gain the advantage of faster frame rates and faster input times, but it does come at the expense of a reduction on resolution. Nothing else seems to be drastically changed aside the larger maps, which tend to rely more on cutting back a little bit of LOD, but overall it's the same version just with a reduction on resolution. Meaning both consoles now target 2720 by 1530, again though with that dynamic width or that reconstruction width dropping down to half that level. Meaning a doubling of frame rate costs us 50% of the pixels at that 60 FPS mode. So overall you're getting a reduction on image quality but a significant boost in performance. The only other difference is the Series X runs an adaptive VSync, meaning it can tear at certain points and also dip frames, whereas the PlayStation 5 runs with VSync engaged like in the 60 FPS mode, and therefore you get dipped frames but no tearing. Although both consoles run pretty much close to 120 FPS locked in other modes, and these bigger Conquest maps can dip into 110s, hardly bad and very hard to spot at these kind of frame rates. And that means in addition to that, input times are improved. A good 25% improvement over the previous 60 FPS mode, coming in around 37 milliseconds on average. So if you want the most competitive shooter, this is the mode to choose.
Loading for a snack. Changing this. Also the enemy's taking the lead. Changing that. Friendly UAV online.
And finally we get to loading. So the PlayStation 5 and Series X come in at a whopping 7 seconds from the main menu into a game, which obviously is going to be more dependent on the network connection than anything else, which is a lot faster, around 3 times faster than it is on the last generation, here represented by the PS4, which comes in around 16 seconds into that same map and loading section. Again though, this isn't going to make that much of a difference in an online multiplayer because you're all going to be waiting for the slowest person to join anyway, but it is welcome that you can at least twiddle your thumbs and spin around around in circles like most people do in these titles. And then finally, there are some other boosts in the engine. The third-person mode does add a little bit of variety to playing it. You still aim down the scopes when you're running around, but you have to get used to the different field of view, certainly when you're throwing frags and they can stick to the wall next to you, but it is welcome that there's some subtle changes to the engine overall. It certainly needs them. But outside of that, there's not a significant change in this engine. It still has the same screen space reflection artifacts present way back with Advanced Warfare at the beginning of the last generation on the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. So it definitely is an evolution of that engine, but I'm not seeing a great deal here in the multiplayer that's really going to stand out or be a technical masterpiece. But the single player certainly has promise that we can dig into much more once that launches. And that's it for another deep dive into game, pixels, and all things frame rates and input times related. If you like these deep dives into game technology, then keep it IGN Performance Reviews, and we'll catch you on the next one.